The storm hit the hospital the way shame hits a proud man suddenly, without asking for permission, and loud enough to make everyone look up. Lights trembled in the ceiling tiles, monitors blinked in nervous rhythms, and the automatic doors kept gulping the night like a mouth that couldn't close. In that metallic flicker sat a smell that defined the shift bleach, rain, and the copper edge of fear. On the floor, Dr. Adrian Vale moved like a metronome that never missed a beat. People said he was brilliant. He preferred the word efficient, as if compassion could be a variable and patience a problem set. He navigated gurneys and clipped orders, wearing the storm like a crown he had measured and weighed. Behind him, almost invisible to the choreography of medicine, pushed a wide blue mop and a lean man with quiet hands. Miguel Alvarez never interrupted the music of authority. He hummed beneath it, a softer instrument, the one you only heard when the others rested. He had a badge that said Environmental Services and a cart with a holy trinity of hospital survival trash liners, sanitizer, and a coil of ragged towels. Patients said good evening to him because he always said it first. Nurses said thank you because he made their chaos a little less sticky. Adrian never said anything at all, unless something was in his way. It had been a long evening of small tragedies: sprained wrists that pretended to be broken, blood sugars that shouted for attention, fevers that refused to argue with Tylenol. Somewhere between a laceration and a panic attack, a cup of coffee took flight. The brown arc landed like an insult across the nurse's station, down the chart racks, and into the smooth gray river of freshly mopped floor. A few errant drops kissed the toe of Adrian's polished shoe. He stilled, looked at the stain like it had spoken out of turn, and then looked at Miguel, who was already there, already kneeling, a towel in his hand as if he'd been waiting for the moment the way a catcher waits for the pitch. Adrian exhaled through his nose, a humorless smirk, a ritual mask that fit too well. The nurses felt the air tighten and turned away, pretending to search for bandage tape. Miguel cleaned, patient as prayer, and kept his eyes down. He had built a life from the discipline of not meeting certain eyes. But tonight the storm and the fluorescent lights and the brittle music of the monitors made him a little slower, or maybe the smear of coffee was too wide, that unruly brown galaxy spreading toward the medication cart like a stain learning to crawl. Adrian's voice arrived not as a sentence but as a verdict. It said there were standards here. It said some people didn't understand speed. It said a hospital should not be a training ground for incompetence. It said the new residents were faster at cleaning up their mistakes than the janitor was at cleaning up coffee. It said if he wanted a floor polished with pride, he would mop it himself. Laughter, thin and tired, slipped out of one resident and then hid in the chart rack, ashamed of the echo it made. Miguel kept cleaning. He let the words float past like leaves in the rain gutter, because he had learned that catching them only filled your hands with rot. He wrung the towel, watched a brown ribbon fall into the bucket, put the towel back down, and kept moving in circles that looked like forgiveness. He thought of Sophia asleep above the laundromat with a geography textbook for a pillow, thought of the rent due and the brake pads singing a warning every time he turned left, thought of the time before this time when the floor he cleaned had been a warehouse floor, and a supervisor had told him his hands were too clever to belong to a mop. He had preferred the quiet then. Quiet had never ridiculed him. The storm clapped its hands once, hard enough to shake a picture frame, and the doors inhaled the night again. Sirens, maybe, or maybe the wind just inventing one. In the lull, the triage alcove held a sound like a seashell, softer than alarm, sharper than tears. A child's breathing when the body has forgotten how to trust it. The paramedic was still 10 seconds from the curb. The mother was still 5 seconds from the doors, but the sound had already arrived, a living thing desperate for an answer. By the time the gurney broke through the lobby glare, destiny had locked its teeth. A boy with the kind of eyelashes that look painted on Lascaux under an oxygen mask too big for his face. His skin carried the wrong color, as if someone had pressed the blue of the storm into it. His chest moved like a ship in shallow water, caught and scraping bottom. The mother's voice made bargains with air. Someone help him, someone who knows, someone, please. The medic shouted compressed words: severe asthma, no response to bronchodilators, deteriorating in transit, SATs in the 70s, epinephrine given, potential anaphylaxis, unknown trigger. The words piled like a barricade in a narrow street, and behind them came the boy's breath, sandpapery and shrinking. Adrian snapped into motion because that was the machine of him, the part that never failed, The part that could split himself into hands and protocols and stair-step decisions. Respiratory called, EPI prepared, Nebs ready. For attempt 1. IV attempt 2. He wore certainty like a starched white shirt and started issuing orders in a rhythm that felt like salvation if you didn't watch too closely. Nurses responded, their calm, the kind of earned grace you only see in those who have kept vigil with other people's nights. The boy's chest kept its shipwreck pattern. The monitor threw numbers that made the paramedic stare at his boots. Miguel stepped back toward the wall, wanting to shrink until he could fit inside the mop bucket. The rules were simple: keep the path clear, keep the floor dry, keep out of the way. He obeyed rules the way other men kept vows. But the sound of the child's breathing laced fingers through the ribs of the room and tugged. It was not panic he felt, it was memory, rising like a tide you had promised yourself would never come again. He closed his eyes for one blink, and in that aperture of darkness he stood inside another night, another storm, another small body, his own daughter, younger than. Lips splotched and swelling after a neighbor brought cookies made in a kitchen that did not know peanuts the way it should. The rush to the broken order of triage when a child is a puzzle with a missing piece called air. The voice of a nurse telling him to breathe because his panic was making the room smaller. The flash of a doctor's hands, kind and sure. The epi, the wheeze that softened to a new music. The way the world returned like color after you've been underwater. Back in the present, the boy's lips were losing the argument with blue. The vein refused the candela like a shy child hiding behind a mother's leg. The respiratory therapist missed a beat on an awkward seal. Adrian recalibrated and called for another set of hands, then another. He barked for a smaller mask, and it wasn't there because it was still drying by the sink from the last near disaster. The nurse sprinted, the monitor scolded, the mother prayed with the posture of a confession that never ends. On the periphery, Miguel watched the chaos warp time. The mop handle knocked the metal trash can and made a small cymbal sound that somehow broke the spell inside him. He put the mop aside in a quiet lean, as if laying down a tired violin, and took a single step toward the bright center that never belonged to him. No one noticed. Then he took another step. The room felt it this time, like a ripple you're not sure came from wind or something alive under the surface. He did not speak. He did not dare. He simply reached for the drawer he had stocked 100 times, the one where the unloved sizes go, the odd masks and the off-brand catheters and the pediatric blood pressure cuff with the cartoon whales that always seemed to be hiding under the adult range. His hand found the smallest mask by the strap, still damp at the edge from the sink, and he passed it forward with the quiet economy of someone handing a nail to a carpenter mid-swing. The respiratory therapist took it without looking. The seal improved. The boy's chest got a little less lost. Adrian's eyes flicked toward the source of the help and landed on the janitor's face as if it were a misprint on a perfect page. Surprise, then something else that looked like irritation at his own surprise, then a swift return to the algorithm. He moved to intubation prep, voice steady, but the road ahead was full of potholes that had names like swelling and secretions and too late. Another monitor chirped, another number sagged. The boy's fingers curled against the sheet, a sudden open-close that made his mother lurch forward until a nurse caught her shoulders and anchored her with practiced tenderness. The oxygen kissed the line between almost and not enough, and Miguel's throat squeezed with a phantom squeeze he hadn't felt since Sophia's night of terror. He knew this path in his bones, how sometimes the difference between hope and ruin was not a miracle, not a hero, but a series of small, unglamorous, correct moves done quickly and repeated until the body remembered itself. He saw the spacer that should have been attached, the epinephrine that might not be the only answer, the angle of the child's neck that needed the humblest tweak. He also saw the hierarchy, a ladder with rungs that had never had his name on them, and he tasted the metal of fear, not of failure but of overstepping in a place where overstepping could cost a person their paycheck. The storm rattled the windows again, the fluorescent lights hummed like bees making a decision. Adrian took the laryngoscope and the room tightened around his hands because everyone understood the gravity of an airway gone stubborn. For one long second that stretched to the length of a prayer, Miguel stood at the threshold between the man he had learned to be and the man he had once been when life demanded it. Then the boy's chest dipped wrong, the monitor complained like a child who had earned the right to cry, and time snapped. Miguel stepped forward into the spill of light. For a second, no one spoke. The storm hushed as if it too was watching what a man with a mop would dare to do inside a circle reserved for gods in white coats. The janitor's presence didn't make sense there. Hierarchy was the heartbeat of hospitals, and Adrian Vale was the one who kept that rhythm steady. Yet now, something about Miguel's movements, small, calm, efficient, pressed pause on everything else. Adrian noticed the boy's color worsening and snapped his focus back to the airway. "We're losing him," he barked, voice clipped, steady in command but cracked beneath it. The laryngoscope fogged, the boy's throat swelling into impossible geometry. The nurse at his side whispered a number, oxygen saturation dropping, but numbers had stopped being math, they were countdowns. Miguel's instincts, buried under years of silence, clawed their way up. He knew that posture, that gasping, it wasn't asthma anymore, it was a full obstruction. The kind he had seen once, not from textbooks but from the trembling hands of a father trying to save his child in a cramped apartment with a fading emergency line. His body remembered before his mind gave permission. He moved closer, voice low, not to challenge but to reach. "Doctor." "Tilt the head just a little, he can't draw air that way." It was quiet, but it traveled. The suggestion landed between orders and alarms. Adrian's head turned, disbelief tightening his jaw. His first instinct was defense. How dare a janitor correct him in front of his team? But there was something in Miguel's tone, not defiance, not ego, urgency wrapped in lived truth. The kind of voice that comes from people who have begged the universe before. Adrian adjusted, not for Miguel, for the boy. The angle changed, the air moved differently, the monitor flickered in response like a miracle that didn't need credit. One breath, shallow, then another, still fragile, but there. The nurse's exhale broke the silence first. Adrian's mind worked in frames. What just happened, how, and why it wasn't him who saw it first. Pride tightened like a muscle refusing to relax. "Lucky," he muttered, as if the word could file the moment away under coincidence. Miguel didn't answer. He only stepped back to the wall, hands clasped behind him, expression unreadable, except for a flicker of something between relief and grief. The boy still needed more. The allergic reaction had deep roots. Adrenaline could buy minutes but not peace. They prepped for an emergency intubation again, but the IV line refused to cooperate. The veins collapsed, small, elusive. Adrian's voice rose sharper now. "We need access now, someone get the pediatric set." Silence answered. The set wasn't in the tray, restocked late from the supply cart. Miguel knew where it was. He had restocked that shelf himself, hours ago, like he did every night, in the janitorial closet beside the laundry chute, where overflow equipment sometimes ended up when storage ran thin. He hesitated for half a second. It wasn't his place. It never was. But the boy's lips darkened again, and the monitor screamed. He ran, past gurneys, through the hum of disbelief. His shoes slipped on the wet tile, but he didn't stop until the supply closet light hit him in the face. He grabbed the pediatric kit, the smallest one, blue-tagged, the one few even knew existed there, and sprinted back. When he returned, no one asked how he knew. No one had time. Adrian took the set, threaded the line, and this time it worked. After pushed, breath returned, trembling but loyal. The boy's chest rose, higher, smoother, as if the storm outside had decided to rest for a while. A nurse whispered, "He's stabilizing." Another touched her forehead like it was prayer. Adrian leaned back, his hands trembling for the first time that night. Around him, the hum of relief, that strange music only hospitals know. He looked at the janitor, this man who wasn't supposed to be part of the story, and felt a burn of something unfamiliar, not gratitude yet, but the raw beginning of it. "Where did you," he began, but stopped himself. The words stuck. Miguel simply nodded once and turned away, retrieving his mop like a man returning to his rightful place after trespassing into heaven. The floor gleamed again beneath his strokes. But this time, the reflection showed two men, one cleaning, one watching, and neither entirely certain who had saved who. The storm had quieted, but the hospital hadn't. Lightning flickered somewhere far behind the windows, as if trying to remember why it was angry. In Trauma Bay 3, the monitors now spoke in steady syllables, a rhythm that meant alive. The boy was sleeping, small and unknowing, his chest rising in the slow choreography of recovery. Around him, nurses moved softer, whispering to one another with that reverent tone people use after watching something too close to divine. Dr. Adrian Vale stood beside the gurney, gloves still powdered white, eyes fixed on the little face he'd nearly lost. He had done everything right, or so he thought. Yet, when the boy's oxygen had dropped into that terrible place between numbers and prayers, it wasn't his training that had saved him. It was the janitor, a man he mocked an hour ago for mopping too slowly. That truth now pressed against his chest like an invisible hand. He could still hear the laugh he'd thrown at Miguel earlier, echoing against the tile walls, that brittle, careless sound. It came back to him now, not as pride but as noise he wanted to silence. He didn't know what to say, so he said nothing at all. Instead, he watched the janitor quietly finish disinfecting the floor under the empty trauma bay next to the boys. Miguel's movements were the same as before, patient, precise, invisible, except now, everyone noticed them. One of the residents leaned toward Adrian and whispered, "That janitor knew what to do before we did." Adrian didn't answer. He simply adjusted his stethoscope, pretending the question wasn't a mirror. Miguel felt their eyes now heavier than before. Some curious, some grateful, some confused about where to place a man who didn't belong in their hierarchy but had just rewritten it. He didn't like being looked at. He'd spent years perfecting the art of being background, a steady rhythm behind other people's urgency. But tonight, he couldn't disappear, not completely. As he wrung out his mop, a flash of memory cut across his thoughts like lightning through glass. Sophia, 8 years old, standing in their small kitchen after surviving her own storm years ago. Her breathing steady again, her hands wrapped around a mug of warm water. She had whispered to him then, her voice a fragile echo, "Papa, you knew what to do." He had smiled, telling her it wasn't him. It was the doctor that night, the one who hadn't hesitated. But deep down he remembered the truth. It was both of them. The hands of medicine and the heart of a father. Now, in this sterile corridor, he saw both worlds collide again, the trained and the unseen, science and instinct. The memory faded, but her voice lingered like warmth on a cold floor. Adrian approached slowly. He stopped a few feet away, as if unsure how close humility was allowed to stand. "You've seen that before," he said finally, his tone stripped of rank. Miguel didn't look up right away. "Yes, sir," he replied quietly. "Once, my daughter." The doctor hesitated, guilt threading through the seams of his authority. "You acted fast," he murmured. "Most people would have frozen." Miguel gave a small shrug, the kind that hides in ocean. "When it's a child," he said softly, "you don't think about who you are. You just move." The room let that sentence breathe. Even the machine seemed to pause, respectful. Adrian looked at him for a long moment, at the lines of exhaustion on his face, the wet edge of his sleeve, the humility that somehow felt larger than pride. "You saved him," he said finally. Miguel shook his head. "No, doctor, we saved him." It was a simple correction, but it split something open inside Adrian. The way people sometimes laugh before they cry. The way the storm sometimes clears not because it's over, but because it ran out of thunder. For the first time, Adrian offered his hand. Not as a gesture of rank, but of recognition. Miguel hesitated, then took it. At that exact moment, a faint cough echoed from the gurney. The boy stirred, eyes half opening. His mother rushed forward, whispering thank yous that blurred into tears. Adrian instinctively stepped back, giving her space, but when he looked at Miguel again, he realized he'd done the same. Both men had stepped aside for the same reason, to let life take center stage. For the rest of the night, they worked in silence, not the kind born of distance, but of understanding. The floor gleamed beneath them again, reflecting the silhouettes instead of one, and somewhere outside, Sophia slept through the fading storm, unaware that her father had just become the kind of man he once prayed would save her. Morning came the way hospitals always summon it reluctantly. The night shift drifted out like ghosts fading into daylight, and the corridors filled again with the smell of coffee, bleach, and something unspoken that lingered from the storm. News had already begun to travel faster than any lab result. Nurses whispered it between vital checks, orderlies repeated it in the cafeteria. Even the residents traded versions of it as if the story itself had pulse. The janitor who saved a dying child. Dr. Adrian Vale heard fragments of it all day, though no one dared say it in front of him. He moved through the wards with his usual precision, his posture ironed by discipline, but his thoughts weren't his own anymore. They wandered back to that small, decisive moment, the one where he had looked at the janitor not as staff, but as a man who knew. At noon, the child's mother asked to see the doctor again. She waited outside the recovery room, still holding the tiny sock her son had lost in the chaos. When Adrian appeared, she reached for his hands with trembling gratitude. "You saved him," she said, eyes wet. Adrian's throat tightened. He almost nodded habit, but then the truth came before pride. "No," he said softly. "You should thank the man who found the right mask. The one who knew what to do before any of us." The woman frowned, confused. "The other doctor?" Adrian looked down the hallway. Miguel was there, mopping near the exit, the same blue uniform, the same steady rhythm. "No," Adrian said, voice quieter now. "The janitor." The mother followed his gaze, disbelief softening into awe. She walked toward Miguel before he could slip away, her steps slow, purposeful. "Sir," she said, voice trembling, "I don't even know your name." He looked startled, unsure if he should stop mopping. "Miguel," he said simply. "Then thank you, Miguel. My son is breathing because you were here." Her words landed with the weight of all the nights he'd gone unnoticed. Miguel lowered his eyes, murmured something that sounded like, "I just did what anyone would," though they both knew that wasn't true. Most people wouldn't. Across the hall, Adrian watched the scene, his chest heavy with something like shame and grace mixed together. He felt the hierarchy inside him bending, the old shape of his certainty no longer fitting. Later that day, in the staff lounge, one of the residents joked nervously, "Guess we'll all have to ask the janitor for medical tips now." It earned a few uncomfortable laughs, the kind that hide insecurity. Adrian set his coffee down and said quietly, "You could learn worse things than humility from him." The room fell silent. No one laughed after that. When Miguel clocked out that evening, the air outside smelled like wet asphalt and new beginnings. He carried his lunch bag under one arm and looked up at the hospital windows glowing against the night. From the top floor, Adrian watched him go, a small figure beneath a sky still half storm, half light. For a moment, Adrian imagined walking down there, saying something human, something right, but the words were too new in his mouth. Instead, he turned back to his reflection in the glass and saw, faintly, two silhouettes, himself and the man he'd once mocked, blurred together in the shine. That night, when Miguel returned home, Sophia was awake, waiting with her schoolbook open on the table. "Papa, you look tired," she said, yawning. He smiled, sitting beside her. "Long night." Bad night. He thought of the boy, the doctor, the moment when silence had almost cost a life. "No," he said softly, "a good one." Someone listened. Sophia tilted her head, unsure what he meant, but she smiled anyway. She reached for his hand, and he let her small fingers curl into his palm, the same palm that had once held a hospital mask, steady and sure. In another part of the city, Dr. Adrian lay awake, replaying the sound of a janitor's calm voice in his mind. The hospital's lights still glowed faintly through his window, like small reminders that some lessons only arrive in silence. By dawn, both men had drifted into uneasy sleep, one in a small apartment above a laundromat, the other in a downtown condo, but their dreams shared the same image, a child breathing peacefully under hospital lights, and the sound of rain easing into quiet. 3 days passed, but the night of the storm refused to fade. Hospitals have short memories for miracles. They move on, chasing the next emergency, but this one lingered in corners, whispered through coffee breaks and chart rooms. Every new shift seemed to carry the echo, the janitor who saved the boy. Miguel didn't talk about it. He arrived early, as always, checked the disinfectant levels, replaced trash liners, folded cloths into neat stacks. He had no appetite for attention, praise. He'd learn it, had a way of making people uncomfortable when it came from the wrong direction. So he let the story belong to others, but stories, once alive, don't ask permission to grow. On the morning of the third day, Dr. Adrian Vale received an email from hospital administration. It was formal, with the usual bureaucratic polish, commendation for exceptional response under emergency conditions. The line that followed, though, made him stop reading halfway through his sip of coffee. "We have also received a personal letter from the patient's mother, requesting special recognition for a member of environmental services who was present that night." Adrian exhaled, eyes softening. It wasn't the award that mattered, it was the idea that truth, somehow, had reached the surface. At noon, they called Miguel to the conference room. He hesitated at the door, mop still in hand. Inside, the hospital director stood with a paper in one palm and an awkward smile on her face. The staff nurses, residents, even orderlies filled the back of the room, curiosity buzzing like static. "Mr. Alvarez," the director began, "we wanted to acknowledge your actions during the emergency earlier this week. Your quick thinking and calm under pressure made a difference, a life-saving difference." Miguel shifted on his feet. "I just did what anyone—" "No," Adrian interrupted softly from the side of the room, stepping forward. "Not anyone. You did what we should have done sooner." The silence that followed was heavier than applause. The director handed him a folded letter, the envelope still smelling faintly of perfume. Miguel took it carefully, fingers rough against the paper. Inside was a short handwritten note, "To the man who saved my son when I couldn't breathe myself. You reminded me that angels don't always wear white coats." He stared at the words for a long moment. His throat tightened, his eyes refused to stay dry. He looked up, unsure what to say, and found Adrian watching him not as a superior, but as a student learning something he should have known long ago. When the meeting ended, the staff lingered to shake Miguel's hand. Some clapped him on the shoulder, others simply nodded in quiet respect. Even the young resident who had once laughed at the doctor's joke about him couldn't meet his eyes without apology. Outside, in the hallway, Adrian caught up to him. "You didn't just save a boy," he said. "You saved the rest of us from forgetting what we're here for." Miguel smiled faintly, eyes tired but kind. "I didn't save anyone, doctor. The boy just needed someone who wasn't afraid to see him. We all do." Adrian let those words sink in. Then he said, "If you ever wanted to train formally, I could help. You've got instincts medicine can't teach." Miguel shook his head gently. "I'm too old for classrooms." "Then let me learn from you," Adrian said, his voice quiet but certain. The janitor chuckled, a soft, honest sound that carried more grace than any lecture. "Then keep your floors clean," he said, half smiling. "It's where the real work starts." Adrian laughed this time, not mockingly, but freely, almost relieved. That night, as Miguel walked home under a calmer sky, the hospital lights behind him shimmered in puddles along the street. He thought of Sophia, waiting upstairs, and of how he would tell her not about the letter or the praise, but about the moment when silence had turned into voice, and kindness had found its witness. At the same hour, Adrian sat by the window of his office, finishing his report. He wrote the usual clinical details, then paused before closing the file. At the bottom, he added a line he'd never written before. "In emergency medicine, not every hero carries a stethoscope." He read it once more, then smiled quietly. The storm had passed, but its lesson would stay. Outside, the rain began again, softer this time, no longer a warning, just a reminder. The night was almost quiet enough to forget what this place had seen. The monitors hummed softly, the fluorescent lights swayed above like tired stars, and the scent of disinfectant floated through the hallways, familiar, clean, forgiving. Dr. Adrian Vale stood in the corridor, hands tucked into his coat pockets, watching the man who had once been invisible. Miguel Alvarez pushed his cart with the same rhythm as always, the mop gliding like a brush painting order over chaos. But tonight, something was different. The badge on his chest caught the light, Emergency Support Technician, a title born from a storm and carved by respect. No speeches had been made. No cameras had come. Just a quiet change in the system, and into men who had learned, the hard way, what real work means. Adrian approached slowly. "It's late," he said, his voice softer than it used to be. "You could have gone home an hour ago." Miguel smiled without stopping his motion. "There's always one more spill, one more hallway. Hospitals don't really sleep." Adrian nodded, eyes tracing the shine on the floor. "You know," he said, "I used to think the job was about saving people. But maybe it's about something smaller, making sure no one falls before they're saved." Miguel rested his mop against the wall. "Maybe both," he said. "Saving lives and cleaning up after them. It's all the same heart." They stood there for a moment, listening to the pulse of the hospital, the slow beeping of monitors, the shuffle of a night nurse, the whisper of an elevator. It wasn't silence, it was peace. From somewhere down the hall came the sound of a child laughing, the same boy who had once gasped for breath under the storm's fury. His mother pushed him in a wheelchair toward discharge, her eyes meeting Miguel's for the briefest second. She smiled, that quiet kind of smile that says you'll never be forgotten. Miguel exhaled, a small tremor of relief escaping him. Adrian followed the look, then said softly, "He's walking because of you." Miguel shook his head. "He's walking because we were both here when it mattered." Adrian reached into his pocket, pulled out a folded piece of paper, and handed it to him. It was a letter, typed, official, but with a single handwritten line at the bottom. You reminded us that humility saves as many lives as medicine. Miguel read it once, then tucked it into his pocket. You didn't have to. I did, Adrian replied, because I used to look down on the man who mopped the floor that held my patients. And now I know you were holding us all. Miguel's eyes shone under the fluorescent light. Then keep them clean, doctor, he said gently, gripping the handle of the mop again. Because tomorrow, someone else will need this floor. Adrian smiled, not with superiority, but gratitude. Then we'll keep it ready. The two men stood in the dim corridor as the night shifted toward morning. Outside, the rain began again, soft this time, no thunder, no fury. Just the steady rhythm of cleansing, as if the world itself had decided to start over. Miguel wrung the last drop from his mop, the sound small and final. He looked once more down the hallway, rows of rooms, doors half open, the quiet breathing of life inside each one. Then he turned to Adrian, nodded once, and said, "Good night, doctor." "Good night, Miguel." As the janitor walked away, his reflection moved beside him, steady, unbroken, shining beneath the lights. Adrian watched until he disappeared around the corner, the echo of his footsteps fading into something that wasn't loss, but completion. The hospital exhaled. The storm was over. And for the first time, both men finally stood on the same ground.